There comes a moment in every empath's journey when their greatest gift becomes their most dangerous enemy. Not the world's cruelty, not others' rejection, but something far more insidious. The moment when light itself turns inward and begins to devour the vessel that carries it. If you have felt the unbearable weight of your own sensitivity, if you have ever wished you could tear the empathy from your soul like a cancer, then what I am about to reveal may disturb you. For we are not here to speak of healing. We are here to speak of the final transformation that occurs when the empath's light becomes their executioner. This is not a tale of redemption. This is an anatomy of psychic suicide. The slow, methodical way in which the most sensitive souls destroy themselves, not through hatred of others, but through an impossible love that demands their own annihilation. You see, the empath who has not undergone the final initiation lives under a terrible spell. They believe that their worth is measured by how much they can endure, how much pain they can absorb, how completely they can disappear into the service of others. But there is a breaking point, a psychic horizon beyond which the light does not illuminate, but incinerates. I have witnessed this transformation in my deepest patients, those who came to me not because they were broken by the world, but because they were broken by their own goodness. They spoke of feeling like strangers to themselves, of watching their own compassion become a weapon turned inward. They described the horror of realizing that everything they believed about love, about service, about their sacred purpose was a lie constructed by the very forces that sought their destruction. The empath's final transformation is not about becoming harder or more protected. It is about the complete dissolution of the false self that was built upon the altar of others' needs. It is about the terrifying recognition that what they called love was often self-hatred in disguise, that what they named service was frequently self-abandonment, that what they believed was their gift was actually their curse. But here is where the mystery deepens. For in this moment of absolute breakdown, when the light has consumed everything the empath thought they were, something ancient stirs. Not hope, for hope belongs to the ego, something older, something that was waiting beneath the rubble of noble intentions and sacrificial love. The true self, fierce and uncompromising, that refuses to be martyred for anyone's comfort. Consider the mythological phoenix, but not in the way you have been taught. The phoenix does not burn because it chooses to. It burns because fire is its nature. And when that fire finally turns inward, it must either consume completely or transform utterly. The empath in their final transformation becomes this fire. No longer the gentle light that soothes others, but the flame that says, "I will not die for your peace. I will not bleed for your healing. I will not disappear so that you can feel whole." This is not cruelty. This is necessity. For the empath who does not undergo this transformation remains trapped in what I call the sacred wound complex. They believe their suffering has meaning, that their pain serves a higher purpose, that their dissolution is somehow noble. But the unconscious knows better. It knows that no soul was born to be a sacrifice. No heart was designed to break endlessly for other salvation. The dreams of empaths approaching this transformation are often violent, apocalyptic. They dream of burning cities, of drowning in oceans of tears that are not their own, of being torn apart by invisible hands that they recognize as their own compassion. These are not metaphors. They are the psyche's way of showing what happens when empathy becomes autoimmune, when the very faculty meant to connect becomes the instrument of self-destruction. I remember a patient who came to me speaking of a recurring nightmare. In the dream, she stood in a vast cathedral made of mirrors. Each mirror reflected not her face, but the face of someone she had tried to heal, someone whose pain she had absorbed. As she walked through this cathedral of reflections, the mirrors began to crack, one by one, until she was surrounded by shards of broken glass, each piece cutting into her as it fell. She would wake bleeding, though no wounds were visible on her body. This dream, I told her, was not a nightmare. It was a prophecy. The breaking of the mirrors was the breaking of the false empathy that had trapped her in others' reflections. The blood was the price of reclaiming her own face, her own soul, her own right to exist without justification. But the transformation I speak of is not comfortable. It requires the empath to face a truth so shattering that most will choose continued martyrdom rather than confront it. They have been using their empathy as a drug, as a way to feel important, needed, even holy. They have been addicted to the very suffering that they claim to want to heal, because that suffering has given their life meaning, purpose, identity. When this recognition dawns, when the empath sees that their noble self-image was built upon a foundation of unconscious manipulation, of using their sensitivity to control others' responses to them, the light they have carried so proudly becomes a sword of judgment turned inward. They do not know who they are without the suffering. They do not know how to love without bleeding out. They do not know how to exist without being needed. This is the dark night of the empath's soul, darker than any external rejection, deeper than any worldly pain. For it is the moment when they must choose between the familiar agony of false empathy and the unknown terror of authentic selfhood. Many do not survive this choice, not physically, but psychically. They retreat into bitterness, cynicism, or a hardness that is empathy's shadow. They become the wounded healers who wound others, the light bearers who cast shadows, the sensitive ones who numb themselves beyond recognition. But for those who endure, who allow the light to burn away everything that is essentially them, something unprecedented occurs. They discover that beneath the empathy they thought they defined them lies something infinitely more powerful: sovereignty. Not the ego's sovereignty, which seeks to control and dominate, but the soul's sovereignty, which simply is. The sovereign empath does not feel less. If anything, they feel more acutely, more clearly than ever before. But they feel from their own center, not from the scattered fragments of a self spread across everyone else's needs. They can witness suffering without absorbing it, offer presence without losing themselves, love without bleeding out. This transformation cannot be taught. It can only be undergone. It requires the empath to walk directly into the fire of their own light and emerge as something that has no name in our psychological vocabulary. Not healer, not savior, not even empath in the way we commonly understand the term. They become what I call the integrated witness, the one who sees all, feels all, but belongs to none but themselves. The integrated witness knows that true compassion is not the taking on of another's pain, but the fierce refusal to participate in the unconscious dynamics that perpetuate that pain. They know that the kindest thing they can do for someone drowning is not to jump in and drown with them, but to remain on solid ground and throw them a rope.
But this wisdom comes at a cost. The integrated witness often finds themselves alone, misunderstood by those who mistake their boundaries for coldness, their clarity for cruelty. The world, accustomed to empaths who sacrifice themselves, does not know what to do with an empath who refuses the altar. Friends fall away. Family members accuse them of changing, of becoming selfish, of losing their heart. This accusation cuts deeply because part of the empath still believes it might be true. They wonder if they have become the very thing they once despised, someone who feels but does not care, who sees but does not save. This doubt is the final test, for the empath must learn to love their own becoming more than others' comfort, to honor their transformation more than others' expectations. Here we encounter one of the great paradoxes of psychological development. The empath must become apparently heartless to discover their true heart. They must appear to stop caring in order to learn what caring actually means. They must seem to abandon others in order to stop abandoning themselves. This process is often triggered by what appears to be external crisis, but is actually internal revolution. A relationship ends, not because of betrayal or conflict, but because the empath can no longer pretend to be smaller than they are. A job is lost, not due to incompetence, but because the empath can no longer perform the role of the eternally available, endlessly accommodating team player. Friendships dissolve, not from animosity, but from the simple fact that the empath can no longer be the one who listens without speaking, who gives without receiving, who exists as a supporting character in everyone else's story. These losses are mourned deeply, not because the empath regrets their transformation, but because they grieve the innocent person they can never be again. The one who believed that love was self-erasure, that goodness was self-denial, that their highest calling was to disappear so others could shine. That innocence is gone forever, and with them goes a certain sweetness, a particular kind of hope that made the world seem more manageable. In its place arises something harder to categorize, a person who loves fiercely but will not be consumed by love, who feels deeply but will not be defined by their feelings, who serves but will not be enslaved by service. This person confuses those around them because they seem to embody contradictions. They are kinder than before, but less nice, more compassionate but less permeable, stronger but also more vulnerable in their willingness to be real rather than perfect. The dreams change during this period. Instead of drowning in others' emotions or burning in apocalyptic fires, the empath begins to dream of vast spaces, infinite skies, deep oceans that hold them without swallowing them. They dream of speaking in voices they do not recognize, but that feel more true than any words they have spoken while awake. They dream of standing at the edge of great precipices, not to jump, but to survey the landscape of their own becoming. But the most significant change is in how they relate to their empathic abilities. Where once their sensitivity felt like a curse or a burden they were chosen to carry, it now feels like a tool, a faculty they can engage or disengage at will. They discover they can turn their empathy on and off like a radio, tuning in when it serves them and others, tuning out when it threatens to overwhelm their center. This conscious use of empathy is perhaps the most foreign concept to those who have not undergone the transformation. How can one choose when to feel? How can sensitivity be selective? But the integrated witness knows that unconscious empathy is not empathy at all. It is energetic chaos. True empathy requires intention, discernment, and most importantly, choice. The choice to feel another's pain because it serves the highest good, not because one is compelled by unconscious wounds. The choice to offer presence because it is genuinely helpful, not because one's identity depends on being needed. The choice to engage with suffering because it can be transformed, not because one is addicted to the drama of crisis and rescue. This level of consciousness brings its own challenges. The integrated witness must constantly navigate the projections of those who expect them to return to their old patterns. Family members who had become accustomed to having an emotional regulator suddenly find themselves having to process their own feelings. Friends who relied on having a perpetual therapist discover they must learn to comfort themselves. Romantic partners who were drawn to the empath's endless availability feel abandoned when boundaries appear. These reactions are not personal attacks, though they often feel that way. They are the inevitable result of one person's growth disturbing the unconscious contracts that held their relationships together. When the empath stops playing their assigned role in others' psychological dramas, those dramas can no longer function in their familiar patterns. The temptation during this phase is enormous, to return to the old ways, to sacrifice the hard-won sovereignty for the temporary peace that comes from meeting others' expectations. Many empaths cycle back and forth between transformation and regression multiple times before they can fully inhabit their new way of being. Each regression teaches them something vital about the price of unconscious empathy, while each return to sovereignty deepens their commitment to their own evolution. What ultimately sustains the transformed empath through this turbulent period is not willpower or determination, but a growing recognition that they have touched something true, something that exists beyond the approval or disapproval of others, beyond success or failure, beyond even love or loss. They have made contact with their essential nature, and once that connection is established, no external circumstance can fully sever it. This essential nature is not empathic in the way the term is commonly understood. It does not feel what others feel. Instead, it sees what others cannot see, the patterns, the unconscious dynamics, the hidden motivations that drive human behavior. It perceives not through emotional merger, but through a kind of X-ray vision that penetrates pretense and reveals truth. The integrated witness becomes dangerous to unconscious systems because they can see them clearly. They can identify manipulation disguised as need, control masquerading as love, violence hidden beneath politeness. They can sense when they're being pulled into familiar patterns and can choose not to participate, even when that choice makes them the villain in someone else's story. This clarity is perhaps the most valuable gift of the final transformation. The empath who has burned away their false empathy gains access to a perception so acute it borders on prophetic. They can sense the trajectory of relationships, the likely outcomes of choices, the hidden consequences of seemingly benign actions. But with this clarity comes a terrible responsibility. The integrated witness knows things others do not want to know, sees things others refuse to see, understands dynamics that others find threatening to acknowledge. They must learn to carry this knowledge lightly, to speak truth when it serves, to remain silent when it would only wound, to act from wisdom rather than the compulsion to rescue others from their own unconsciousness.
There is a particular loneliness that accompanies this phase of development. The transformed empath finds themselves in a strange liminal space, no longer belonging to the unconscious masses, but not yet fully at home in their new identity. They may feel like anthropologists studying human behavior from the outside, fascinated, but also saddened by the predictable patterns they observe in relationships, families, and social systems. This detachment is not coldness, though it may appear so to others. It is the natural result of seeing through illusions that once provided comfort and meaning. The empath can no longer pretend that surface kindness equals genuine care, that busyness equals purpose, that conformity equals peace. They see the shadow lurking beneath social pleasantries, the desperation hiding behind achievements, the terror masked by constant activity. Such perception is both a gift and a burden. The gift lies in the freedom that comes from no longer being deceived by appearances. The burden lies in the isolation that results from seeing what others cannot or will not see. The transformed empath must learn to hold this double vision with grace, to remain compassionate toward those still trapped in unconscious patterns, while refusing to join them in their sleep. Here we encounter another paradox of the final transformation. The more clearly the empath sees, the more they realize how little they actually know. The arrogance that sometimes accompanies early spiritual development gives way to a profound humility. They begin to understand that every person's journey is unique, that their own clarity does not give them the right to judge others' choices, that wisdom lies not in knowing all the answers, but in asking better questions. This humility opens the door to a deeper level of service, one that does not require the empath to sacrifice themselves or fix others. Instead of rushing in to rescue, they learn to create space for others to find their own solutions. Instead of absorbing others' emotions, they learn to reflect those emotions back with clarity and compassion. Instead of taking responsibility for others' healing, they learn to trust the inherent wisdom of each soul to heal itself when ready. The language itself becomes a tool of transformation. The sovereign empath learns to speak in ways that invite rather than demand, that suggest rather than insist, that honor the listener's autonomy rather than diminishing it. They discover that truth can be offered as a gift rather than imposed as a burden, that love can be expressed through respect for boundaries rather than violation of them. But perhaps the most significant shift occurs in the empath's relationship with their own emotions, where once they were flooded by feelings that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, they now experience emotions as information, as energy in motion, as temporary visitors rather than permanent residents. They learn to feel fully without being overwhelmed, to experience intensity without losing their center. This emotional sovereignty is not achieved through suppression or denial. Rather, it emerges from a deep acceptance of the feeling nature, coupled with the recognition that emotions are not the self, but expressions of the self. The transformed empath can experience rage without becoming a rageful person, feel grief without becoming a grieving person, touch joy without grasping after it. Such emotional fluidity becomes a model for others, though the teaching happens more through example than through words. People sense something different in the presence of the sovereign empath, a quality of being that is both deeply feeling and fundamentally stable. They feel permission to be authentic without fear of overwhelming or being overwhelmed, to express vulnerability without losing respect, to show up as they are rather than as they think they should be. The transformation also affects the empath's relationship with time. Where once they lived in a constant state of emergency, always rushing to respond to the next crisis, they now inhabit a deeper rhythm. They learn to distinguish between true urgency and manufactured drama, between what requires immediate attention and what can wait. This shift from reactive to responsive living creates space for reflection, for choice, for the kind of deep presence that actually heals. In this space, the empath discovers that their most powerful gift is not their ability to feel others' pain, but their capacity to remain unshaken by it. They become like a mountain that witnesses storms without being moved, like deep water that reflects the sky without being disturbed by surface waves. This quality of unmoved presence is more healing than any amount of emotional absorption or sympathetic suffering. The final transformation also brings a new understanding of boundaries. The untransformed empath often thinks of boundaries as walls, as barriers that keep others out and make one selfish or unkind. The sovereign empath recognizes boundaries as the very foundation of relationship, the clear delineation that allows true intimacy to occur. They understand that without boundaries, there is no self to offer, no authentic presence to share. These boundaries are not rigid or punitive, but fluid and responsive. They shift based on circumstances, relationships, and the empath's own energy levels.
Most importantly, they are maintained not through aggression or withdrawal, but through calm, clear communication and consistent follow-through. The sovereign empath learns to say no with the same grace with which they say yes, understanding that both responses can be expressions of love. This transformation of boundary setting becomes particularly important in intimate relationships. The untransformed empath often attracts partners who are unconscious, wounded, or narcissistic. People who are drawn to the empath's willingness to absorb their pain and provide endless emotional regulation. These relationships are characterized by patterns of caretaking and crisis, of the empath giving more and more while receiving less and less. The sovereign empath breaks these patterns not through judgment or condemnation, but through the simple act of refusing to participate. They no longer rush to soothe their partner's distress, no longer sacrifice their own needs to maintain peace, no longer accept responsibility for emotions that belong to someone else. This shift often triggers intense reactions from partners who have become dependent on the old dynamic. Some relationships survive this transformation, evolving into more balanced and conscious partnerships. Others end, not because love has died, but because the unconscious contracts that held them together have been dissolved. The sovereign empath learns to accept both outcomes with equanimity, understanding that true love honors each person's growth even when that growth leads them in different directions. This transformation extends beyond personal relationships to encompass the empath's role in their family of origin, their workplace, and their community. In each context, they must learn to navigate the expectations and projections of others while remaining true to their evolving sense of self. This is particularly challenging in family systems, where roles are often rigidly defined and change is seen as betrayal.
The empath, who has served as the family's emotional regulator, mediator, or peacekeeper, faces intense pressure to return to these familiar functions. Family members may use guilt, manipulation, or even threats to pull the empath back into old patterns. The sovereign empath must learn to love their family without being enslaved by their dysfunction, to maintain connection without enabling unconscious behavior. This process requires tremendous courage, for it often means disappointing people who have depended on the empath's willingness to sacrifice themselves for family harmony. But the transformed empath recognizes that true service to their family lies not in perpetuating unhealthy dynamics, but in modeling a different way of being. By refusing to participate in familiar patterns, they create space for new possibilities to emerge. At work, the sovereign empath faces similar challenges. They can no longer be the one who stays late to finish others' projects, who absorbs their colleagues' stress, who smooths over conflicts by taking responsibility that isn't theirs. This shift in behavior often creates tension with supervisors and coworkers who have become accustomed to the empath's self-sacrificing tendencies. Yet this transition also opens opportunities for more authentic forms of leadership and contribution. The sovereign empath's clarity of perception, emotional wisdom, and ability to see patterns makes them valuable in ways that transcend their previous role as the office therapist or crisis manager. They become the person others turn to for perspective, for honest feedback, for the kind of insight that comes from deep self-knowledge. The community sees similar shifts, where once the empath might have been involved in every cause, present at every gathering, available for every crisis. They now choose their involvements more carefully. They learn to distinguish between activities that align with their authentic purpose and those that simply satisfy the ego's need to be needed. This selectivity allows for deeper engagement with fewer commitments, more meaningful impact with less burnout. Throughout all these changes, the sovereign empath must continually return to the question of identity. Who are they when they are not defined by their role as helper, healer, or emotional caretaker? What remains when the familiar patterns fall away? This is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the transformation. The possibility that beneath all the doing, the giving, the feeling for others, there might be nothing at all. But this fear proves unfounded. What emerges is not emptiness, but essence, the irreducible core of being that exists independent of role, function, or others' needs. This essence is simultaneously deeply personal and utterly universal, uniquely individual, and profoundly connected to the whole. It is what the mystics call the true self, what psychologists term authentic identity, what poets recognize as soul. Discovering this essence does not eliminate the empathic gifts, but transforms their expression. The sovereign empath still feels deeply, still perceives subtleties that others miss, still carries a natural capacity for healing presence. But these gifts now serve the whole, rather than compensating for wounds. Express love rather than seeking validation. Honor life rather than fleeing from death. The final transformation is never truly final. It is an ongoing process of refinement, of deepening integration, of learning to embody sovereignty in increasingly subtle ways. Each day brings new opportunities to choose consciousness over compulsion, presence over performance, authentic service over self-sacrifice. The path requires constant vigilance, not against the world, but against the persistent tendency to slip back into unconscious patterns. Yet this vigilance is not burdensome, but energizing. The sovereign empath has tasted freedom and cannot forget its flavor. They have experienced what it means to live from their center rather than their circumference, to love without losing themselves, to serve without being depleted. This taste of authenticity becomes an internal compass, guiding them back to truth whenever they stray. The world needs empaths who have undergone this transformation. In a time of widespread unconsciousness, of systems that depend on emotional labor without acknowledgement or compensation, of relationships that consume rather than nourish, the sovereign empath becomes a beacon of possibility. They demonstrate that it is possible to feel deeply and think clearly, to care profoundly and maintain boundaries, to serve powerfully without self-destruction. But perhaps most importantly, they prove that the light need not consume the one who carries it. When empathy is conscious rather than compulsive, when sensitivity is paired with strength, when compassion flows from wholeness rather than woundedness, the light becomes not a burden, but a gift, to the one who bears it and to all those whose lives it touches. This is the empath's true destiny, not to burn as fuel for others' comfort, but to shine as a reminder of what conscious feeling, sovereign sensitivity, and integrated empathy can offer a world hungry for authentic connection and genuine healing. The journey from unconscious absorption to conscious witness, from martyred healer to sovereign empath, is not for the faint of heart. It requires everything and promises nothing except the possibility of living as who you truly are, rather than who others need you to be. For those called to this path, no other choice remains viable. The light that once threatened to consume them has taught them its greatest lesson, that true illumination comes from not burning oneself as fuel, but from learning to shine with the steady, unshakable radiance of an integrated soul.